is up first until about 11 a.m. Eastern. At that point, lawmakers will turn to work on transportation projects and programs as Senate leaders continue to negotiate a way forward with the bill. And now live Senate coverage here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. Today's opening prayer will be offered by Reverend Dr. Costa G. Christo, Senior Pastor of the St. George Greek Orthodox Cathedral in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Let us bow our heads in prayer, being mindful of and protect, O Lord, these United States of America, our civil authorities, our armed forces by land, sea, and air, and all who reside and find shelter and refuge in this country from sea to shining sea, because blessed is that nation whose God is the Lord. During these times of economic instability at home and across the globe, give us hope, restore order to our inner chaos, and strengthen our faith, because you are the God of all possibilities, sound judgment, stability, new beginnings, moderation, prudence, justice, and everlasting love, mercy, peace, and compassion. Enable our nation, the land of the free and the home of the brave, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, to be the example par excellence for all civilizations under the heavens. Furthermore, let our esteemed senators be your instruments to bless our nation and the entire world. For to you belongs the kingdom, the power, and the glory forevermore. Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., February 16, 2012. To the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Tom Udall, a senator from the state of New Mexico, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President Pro Tempore.
President.
The majority leader is recognized.
Following leader remarks, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for an hour. The majority will control the first half, Republicans the second half. Following that morning business, the Senate will resume consideration of the Surface Transportation Bill. Mr. President, we're doing our utmost to work through the matters that we still have to do here in the Senate. We have pending now a cloture motion on the Surface Transportation Bill. That time will ripen tomorrow morning, an hour after we come in. Following that, there's a vote on a person who, from New York, who desires to be a federal judge. We will notify all members when the conference report is scheduled in the House, and we'll do it over here as quickly as we can. We're going to see if things can be expedited, but it appears that we'll be in at least for tomorrow. I hope that we won't be any longer than that. But it all depends on when the House completes the work on the conference report. That's not scheduled yet. Mr. President, there's a bill at the desk due for a second reading. It's S-2111.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the second time.
S-2111, a bill to enhance punishment for identity theft and other violations of data privacy and security.
I would object to any further proceedings with respect to this bill at this time.
Objection is heard. The bill will be placed on the calendar.
I would ask the chair to announce the business of the day.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for 1 hour, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, and with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the majority controlling the first half and the Republicans controlling the final half.
Would note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator from Mississippi is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be called off.
Without objection.
And thank you very much, Mr. President. I expect to be joined in a moment by my colleague and good friend, Senator Cardin. He and I, and perhaps others, will be talking today about the deteriorating situation in Russia with regard to human rights and the rule of law. I came to the floor in November to speak about the deteriorating situation. I spoke about the wrongful imprisonment and tragic death of Russian lawyer Sergei Magnitsky. I will also state at this point that I will be happy to yield to my colleague from Maryland to actually kick this thing off. I think that was the agreed upon order, and staff felt that I would have a few moments, but I'd be glad to defer to my friend.
President.
Senator from Maryland.
Could I ask unanimous consent that there be 30 minutes available for a colloquy controlled by Senator Wicker and myself?
Without objection.
Thank you very much. And let me thank Senator Wicker for starting us off on the discussion of what's happening in Russia today. I rise today, along with some of my colleagues, to bring attention to the growing issue of human rights violations in Russia, typified by the case of Sergei Magnitsky. Just last week, as part of a bilateral presidential commission, Attorney General Holder met with Russian Minister of Justice to discuss the rule of law issues. That same week, Russian officials moved in their criminal prosecution of Sergei Magnitsky. Mr. President, I remind you that Mr. Magnitsky has been dead for more than 2 years. Last May, I joined with Senator McCain and Senator Wicker and 11 other of our senators from both parties to introduce the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act. We now have nearly 30 co-sponsors, and I urge more to join us and look at ways to move forward on helping halt abuses like this in the future. After exposing the largest known tax fraud in Russia history, Sergei Magnitsky, a Russian tax lawyer working for an American firm in Moscow, was falsely arrested for crimes he did not commit and tortured in prison. 6 months later, he became seriously ill and was consistently denied medical attention despite 20 formal requests. And then on the night of November 16, 2009, he went into critical condition. But instead of being treated in a hospital, he was put in an isolation cell, chained to a bed, beaten by 8 prison guards with rubber batons for 1 hour and 18 minutes until he was dead. Sergei Magnitsky was 37 years old, left behind a wife, 2 children, and a dependent mother. While the facts around his arrest, detention, and death have been independently verified and accepted at the highest levels of Russia's government, those implicated in his death and the corruption he exposed remain unpunished in positions of authority, and some have even been decorated and promoted. Following Magnitsky's death, they have continued to target others, including American business interests in Moscow. These officials have been credibly linked to similar crimes and have ties to Russian mafia, international arms trafficking, and even drug cartels. The money they stole from the Russian budget was laundered through a network of banks, including 2 in the United States. Calls for investigation have fallen on deaf ears. In an Orwellian turn of events, the law enforcement officers accused of Magnitsky and those most involved in his murder and those that are accused by Magnitsky and those most complicit in his murder are moving to try him for the very tax crimes they committed. Think of the irony here. He exposed corruption in Russia. As a result, he was arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and killed. Now, those who perpetrated the crime on him are charging him after his death with the crimes they committed. We cannot be silent. And one of the most articulate voices in the United States Senate on this issue has been Senator Wicker, who is the leading Republican on the Helsinki Commission, and I applaud him for his efforts not only on bringing the Magnitsky abuse to public attention and what's happening in Russia, but in many other areas where human rights violations have occurred, and I'd be glad to allow my colleagues some time on this issue.
Well, I thank my colleague from Maryland, and yes, indeed, there are other cases of human rights violations, not the least of which I have highlighted time and again on this Senate floor, being the cases of Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Platon Lebedev. Each is an appalling story, just as the one Senator Cardin pointed out with regard to Mr. Magnitsky. A story about the criminality and corruption within the Russian government itself. My colleagues and I will continue to speak out about these cases in the hope that attention will inspire change. I look forward to the day when a focus of a floor statement can be about the progress we've made with Russia. It's something my colleague and I dearly look forward to. We look for the day when Russia begins to uphold democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. But unfortunately, today is not the day. In recent months, an overwhelming number of headlines out of Russia focus on the Russian Spring. Opposition groups, citizens, and in many cases the mainstream media have reacted to moves by the Russian regime they view as no longer acceptable. On September 24 of last year, President Medvedev struck a deal that would clear the way for his predecessor, Vladimir Putin, to run next month for a 3rd presidential term. As the Wall Street Journal noted in an opinion piece last December, even the most thick-skinned citizens saw that turning the presidency into the object of a private swap and made a mockery of the Constitution. Russia's fraudulent parliamentary elections in December further deepened the political crisis and affirmed the erosion of democracy. Secretary Clinton, our Secretary of State, called them neither free nor fair. So this is a bipartisan a denunciation of the process. Observers have claimed that 12 to 15% of the votes were falsified in favor of the United Russia Party. According to most analysts, improvement is not expected in the upcoming presidential election this March. But these corrupt actions have not been ignored. On December 10, more than 60,000 Russians took to the streets of Moscow in protest. Similarly, on February 4th, some 120,000 citizens from across the political spectrum braved below-zero weather during a pro-democracy march in central Moscow. Their demands were clear: release political prisoners like Khodorkovsky and Lebedev, allow opposition parties to register, hold free and fair elections, and pledge not to give a single vote to Putin on March 4th. Similar rallies were held in small towns across Russia. We can be glad for the call for reform, and we're glad that it's growing louder. According to a February poll by Russia's independent Levada Center, 43% of Russians now support pro-democracy protests. Additional protests are already scheduled for later this month. Now, specifically, let me once again underscore the horrific facts about Sergei Magnitsky, because it needs to be heard, and perhaps some of our colleagues were not listening the first time. In the midst of this public outcry and demand for democratic process, the news out of Russia with regard to Mr. Magnitsky is almost unbelievable. Just last week it was revealed that the police in Russia plan to retry the tax evasion case of the late Sergei Magnitsky. As many of my colleagues are aware, Mr. Magnitsky is already dead. He died in Russian detention more than 2 years ago. He was a lawyer and a partner in an American-owned law firm based in Moscow. He was married with 2 children, as my friend has said. His clients included the Hermitage Fund, which is the largest foreign portfolio investor in Russia. Through his investigative work on behalf of Hermitage, Mr. Magnitsky discovered that Russian Interior Ministry officers, tax officials, and organized criminals worked together to steal $230 million in public funds, orchestrating the largest tax rebate fraud in the history of the Russian Republic. In 2008, Mr. Magnitsky voluntarily gave sworn testimony against officials from the Interior Ministry, Russian tax departments, and the private criminals whom he found had perpetrated the fraud. A month later, an arrest was made, and the person arrested was Mr. Magnitsky himself. He was placed in pretrial detention, and he was held without trial for 12 months. While in custody, he was pressured and tortured by Russian officials, hoping he would withdraw his testimony and falsely incriminate himself and his client. But he refused to do so, and his conditions worsened and his health worsened, Mr. President. He spent months without medical care. Requests for medical examination and surgery were denied by Russian government officials. On November 13, 2009, Mr. Magnitsky's condition deteriorated dramatically. Doctors saw him on November 16 when he was transferred to a Moscow detention center that actually had medical facilities. Yet instead of being treated at those facilities immediately, he was placed in an isolation cell, handcuffed, beaten until he died. In the months following his death, Russian officials repeatedly denied facts concerning his health condition. The Russian State Investigative Committee claimed that Magnitsky was not pressured nor tortured, but died naturally of heart disease, and his death was nobody's fault. This is from the Russian government. Since then, Mr. Magnitsky's death, 2 subsequent reviews have helped clarify some of the facts. in late December of 2009, the Moscow Public Oversight Commission, an independent watchdog mandated under Russian law to monitor human rights, issued its conclusions on this case. And this independent Russian Oversight Commission stated that in detention, Magnitsky had been subjected to torture, physical and psychological pressure, that he was denied medical care, and that his right to life had been violated by the Russian state. The conclusions were sent to the Russian General Prosecutor's Office, the Russian State Investigative Committee, the Russian Ministry of Justice, and the Presidential Commission. None of these agencies have responded to the report's conclusions. Now, more recently, a second finding was issued by the Russian President's Human Rights Council. It issued its independent expert findings on the case. The report found that Magnitsky was arrested on trumped-up charges, yet they're being brought forward again after his unfortunate death. In breach of Russian law and in breach of the European Human Rights Convention, and that his prosecution was unlawful, that he was systematically denied medical care, that he was beaten in custody, which was a proximate cause of his death, and that his medical records were falsified, and that there is an ongoing cover-up and resistance by all government bodies to investigate. Mr. President, Senator Cardin and I, and Senator McCain and others have no choice but to continue coming to this floor, continue using every forum that we can possibly use to bring these facts to light. And I would yield back. I've taken quite a bit of our time with my prepared statement. I yield back to my friend from Maryland as to any other thoughts that he might have. And I want to commend his leadership with regard to the legislation. Do I understand now, Senator, that we have some 30 co-sponsors?
That is correct. And again, I thank you for your leadership, and I thank you for your comments. We have 30 co-sponsors of the Magnitsky legislation that I'm going to be encouraging more of our colleagues to join us in co-sponsorship. I want to talk a little bit about that, if I might. But let me just underscore the point that Senator Wicker pointed out. Mr. Magnitsky died 2 years ago through crimes that were perpetrated on him that have been well documented. The Russian Federation is now charging him after his death with those crimes. After his death. Not even in Stalin time did they try people after they died. This is the first time in Russia history that a man has been tried after his death. Further, they have summoned Mr. Magnitsky's widow and ailing mother as witnesses against their husband and son. This is a new chapter in brazen impunity. An editorial last week in the Financial Times observed that if he's convicted, and I'm going to quote from the Financial Times, the accused's citizenship could be revoked, he could be exiled, forced to die somewhere else. End quote. That might be funny if it wasn't real. If it wasn't enough, Russian Justice Minister recently proposed that the United States and Russia conclude an extradition treaty. Legal farces like what we have seen in the case of Sergei Magnitsky or many others bring reasonable people to only two conclusions, both of which are profoundly disturbing. Either senior leaders are not the ones running the country, or the senior leadership is complicit in these outrages. The Magnitsky story sounds like a Hollywood thriller, but his case is real, and the rampant corruption, violence, and lawlessness does exist in the Russian government. His cause has become a global campaign for justice. As Senator Wicker pointed out, the popular opinion in Russia is on the side of justice. There's been over 4,000 stories on Sergei Magnitsky since his death in Russia. We know from countless historical cases, such as the death in police custody of the anti-apartheid activist Steve Biko in 1977 that one person's life and sometimes death can change the system. And since we're now living on the Internet, such change often comes much faster than expected. Mr. President, I'm going to comment about the legislation that I filed and the need for us to consider that. But I noticed that Senator Shaheen is on the floor. Senator Shaheen is a member of the Helsinki Commission. She also chairs the European Subcommittee on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and has been an outspoken champion on behalf of human rights. And I'm pleased that she's here, and I'd like to give her an opportunity. I see that she's prepared to talk about this issue.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you very much, Senator Cardin. I really want to thank you and Senator Wicker for your efforts today coming down to the floor to raise this important human rights issue. As you say, if we didn't see the facts, we would believe this was fiction, what's going on in Russia today. But I think these efforts are particularly important given what's happening today in Russia. We've seen historic demonstrations on the streets of Moscow over the last several months. Ordinary Russian citizens, fed up with nearly a decade of corruption, have courageously taken to the streets to demand that their voices be heard. The fraudulent Duma elections and the cynical and manipulative decision by Prime Minister Putin to return to the presidency have reawakened civil society throughout Russia. As a leading Russian social activist, Alexei Navalny wrote from his jail cell following the peaceful December demonstrations, quote, "We all have the only weapon we need, and the most powerful. That is the sense of self-respect." Today, as we call for justice for human rights abuses in Russia, we also stand with those brave Russian citizens who have risked so much in calling for their rights to be respected, just as Sergei Magnitsky did. As we've seen throughout this last year of upheaval around the globe, the rising voice of a public driven to peaceful protest can be deafening. Prime Minister Putin and his regime would be wise to listen to the people of Russia. I also want to echo what Senators Wicker and Cardin have said about the importance of passing the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act. There are now 28 Senate co-sponsors. I am one of those co-sponsors, and I'm proud to be. And I want to associate myself with what you all have said on the floor of the Senate today. The case of Mr. Magnitsky is a tragic one. He was falsely imprisoned, beaten, denied medical care, and ultimately killed, as you all have so eloquently explained. And to this day, no one has been held accountable for his tragic and unnecessary killing. We stand here today to press for accountability in Mr. Magnitsky's death. However, I think it's important for us to reiterate that this is more than simply a question of one man's tragic case. The State Department's Human Rights Report for this year describes numerous violations. As you said so well, Senator Cardin, attacks on journalists, physical abuse of citizens, harsh prison conditions, politically motivated imprisonments, and other government harassment and violence. The European Court of Human Rights has issued more than 210 judgments holding Russia responsible for grave human rights violations, including abductions, killings, and torture in Chechnya and throughout the Northern Caucasus. There are many more cases like Magnitsky, which is why the bill before us is so important. It seeks to ensure that no human rights abusers in Russia or elsewhere in the world are granted the privilege of traveling to this country or utilizing our American financial system. As chair of the Subcommittee on European Affairs, I was pleased to preside over a hearing on our Magnitsky bill and on the state of human rights in Russia. I want to thank Chairman Kerry for helping to make that hearing possible. During the hearing, we had a very constructive conversation with State Department officials, and we heard unanimous support for the legislation from an impressive panel of human rights activists and Russian experts. We've also received letters, and I'm going to introduce these letters into the record, from leading human rights and civil society leaders in Russia calling on the Senate to pass the Magnitsky Bill. Around the world, governments are also taking up this important call. The European Parliament, Canada, the Netherlands are considering similar pieces of legislation. And this summer, the U.S. State Department barred dozens of Russian officials from traveling to the U.S. over their involvement in the death of Magnitsky. I want to commend the administration, and particularly Secretary Clinton, for her strong words condemning the recent fraudulent elections in Russia. But despite all these efforts, there is more we can do to support human rights and civil society, freedom of expression in Russia. Passing the Magnitsky Bill this year is one of them. In the midst of an election year, at a time of difficult partisanship, I believe this is one effort, as we've seen so well from Senator Cardin and Senator Wicker here today, this is one effort that both sides of the aisle can agree on. And we stand here unambiguously today in support of rule of law, democracy, and respect for human rights in Russia. And I hope that our colleagues in the Congress and at the State Department will work constructively in the months ahead to pass this critical piece of legislation. And, Mr. President, Senators, before I yield the floor, I also think it's important to call attention to the particularly egregious act that Russia committed in recent days before the United Nations when they vetoed the Security Council resolution aimed at halting the ongoing violence in Syria. Today, more than 25,000 people have fled Syria. More than 7,000 innocent Syrians have died at the hands of President Assad. And despite Syria's growing isolation, Russia continues to harbor and arm the Syrian regime. This is unacceptable, and I think our passage of the Magnitsky Bill will send a very strong sign to Russia that not only in the Magnitsky case and other human rights abuses in country are they going to be held accountable, but their actions internationally will also make them accountable to the international community. So again, thank you to Senator Cardin and Senator Wicker for your leadership on this issue. I'm very pleased and honored to be able to join you in making this fight. Well,
Mr. President, we are honored to have Senator Shaheen join us, and I know there are others who would like to be here today. We're here to tell the sordid facts of this case, but we're also here because change can occur. If this were completely hopeless, what would be the point of this exercise? Change occurred in Eastern Europe, and I must admit there was a time in my younger days when I doubted it would ever occur. And my hat is off to the intrepid members of the Public Oversight Commission who had the courage to issue a report critical of their government, to the Russian President's Human Rights Council. So voices are being heard. There is a thread of truth coming from the almost iron curtain of authoritarianism that we've reverted to in Russia. The senator from New Hampshire mentioned other organizations in Russia, and I'm glad she has inserted those letters into the record. I also would point out that I have to applaud the international reaction. In December, the European Parliament passed a resolution recommending an EU-wide travel ban and asset freeze for officials tied to Mr. Magnitsky's death. But we need to act as a Senate and as a Congress. And so I'm calling on every senator within the sound of my voice today, Mr. President, every legislative director dealing with defense and foreign policy issues, once again to look at the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act. I will tell my friend from New Hampshire that the number is now up to 30 we learned on the floor today from Senator Cardin. So we have 30 senators involved. We really ought to have a majority of senators before the end of this day if people would just take the time to look. Again, I join her in congratulating the Foreign Relations Committee on bringing further light to this. I thank the State Department, as she said, and I would simply conclude my portion of this by saying recent events make it even more important that the Foreign Relations Committee and that this Senate take up and pass this legislation. I urge all of my colleagues to consider joining us on this legislation.
Let me, if I might, Senator Shaheen, I want to thank you for your comments, but more importantly, I want to thank you for your leadership. The hearing that you held on the Sergei Magnitsky bill was very, very helpful. First of all, I think it answered the question of why we should care. Now, we all understand America's leadership on moral issues, and the world looks to America to stand up against these fundamental abuses of human rights. So that in and of itself is a reason for us to act. But it was also apparent from the hearings that these criminals, these violations in Russia involve our financial institutions. So we are talking about the integrity of American companies to be able to do business internationally. So it's not only the moral issue that we have a right to speak out, and as my two colleagues on the floor know, under the commitments that we all signed on to in the Helsinki in 1975, we have committed ourselves to basic human rights and the obligation of any member state to question the conduct in another state. And Russia is a signator of the Helsinki Final Act. The United States is a signator. So we have a responsibility to bring this to the attention. But we could do more. You know, what can we do about this? Well, there are many aspects of the Magnitsky tragedy that are difficult for us to pursue here in the United States. It can't be our criminal justice system. It's got to be the Russian system that has to be reformed to deal with this. But there are steps that we can take. And the legislation that we all have filed recognizes that the right to visit America is a privilege granted by the United States. The visa is a privilege. There's no guaranteed right to come to America. And one thing we can do is say those who are committing these gross human rights violations should not be given the privilege of entering into the United States. I want to acknowledge and thank Secretary of State Clinton for taking action against human rights violators. That's the right policy to do. The legislation that we have authored institutionalizes a process where we deny the right for those individuals to visit and come into the United States. Obviously, that has a price to them. And, of course, what we're trying to do is get the government, in this case Russia, to do what's right. The second thing we could do is deal with their financial participation in U.S. institutions. You know, these people do get involved in international finance. They do have resources that travel through U.S. financial institutions, and we do have laws that allow us to hold those funds. Through due process, we can do that. And that is the reason why the legislation that we have talked about today, the legislation that I introduced along with my colleagues, would institutionalize those types of changes. For those who think it may not mean much, let me just remind you about what we did when the Soviet Union denied the rights of Jews to be able to leave the country. Here in the United States Congress, we took action by legislation. Many said, would that make any difference? It made a huge difference, and it brought about change in the Soviet Union. Other countries followed our leadership. As both of my colleagues have pointed out, if we act, other countries will act. It will become the norm, and that will help us establish the expectation that countries do need to address tragedies such as Sergei Magnitsky, hold those responsible accountable, and more importantly, take steps so it never happens again. That is what we are attempting to do by moving forward with this legislation. And as Senator Wicker said, we do urge our colleagues to join us in this effort. Senator Wicker, you mentioned what's happening around the world as we see countries go through a democratic transformation that we never thought we would see. We saw in our lifetime what happened in Eastern Europe. And now we see some really model democracies, our NATO allies, that countries just a few decades ago we thought would be our enemies to this date. So we've seen change occur. And we want to be on the right side of this issue, right side of history, on moving forward Russia with the type of reforms that the people of Russia are entitled. We have the right to do that under the Helsinki Act. We have the responsibility to point these issues out, and we can take action that can make a huge difference. So, Mr. President, that is why we are engaged in this discussion today, to say, look, we want Russia to do the right thing. We want to speak out for the Russian people, and we think that we can play a very important role. The U.S. Helsinki Commission that I have the honor of being the Senate chair, and Senator Wicker is the lead Republican on the Senate side, we have a proud history of putting a spotlight on problems. You know, people don't like name-calling, but you've got to point out where the violations occur. Unfortunately, if you don't do it, it becomes statistics. But when you put a face on it, and you realize these are people who have families that have been abused because they're trying to do the right thing, you can get action. And that's why I am so proud of the legacy of the U.S. Helsinki Commission and what we've been able to do. And this is another chapter in that proud history of saying that we're going to stand up for basic human rights, that that's a priority of our country, and we can do better. And we can do justice for Sergei Magnitsky, and we can do justice for the people of Russia.
Will the senator yield for a question?
I'd be glad to allow my colleague from...
One of the things that you talked about so eloquently is our ability here, as we look at our financial systems, to help impact what's happening in Russia. One of the things that we heard about at the hearing on the Magnitsky bill was from the head of the American Chamber in Russia, who talked about what the impact is on American companies trying to do business of this kind of case and the concern that it raises about issues of corruption and the ability to operate freely in Russia. So don't you agree that one of the things that we can do is also to urge those companies who are operating in Russia to speak out when cases like this happen and they have concerns about what it does to their business in the country?
Well,
the majority's 30 minutes has expired.
And we're going to yield the floor. Let me just agree with my colleague, Senator Sheehan. You're absolutely right. And it's a lot easier for them to be able to speak out if they know that we are going to continue to raise these issues. Mr. President, I want to thank Senator Wicker and Senator Sheehan. I thank you for your attention. And with that, we would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Wyoming is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the floor today as someone who sat through the President's State of the Union, and just come from a Senate Energy Committee hearing. I sat through the State of the Union near the Secretary of Energy and was happy when I heard some of the comments of the President as he talked of an all-of-the-above strategy, needing all of the various sources of energy. But this Monday, the President's budget came out, which is very different than that. It's a budget that I'd like to discuss this morning and talk about because as I read through it, it looks to me as though the President has abandoned his role as leader of the nation by not being honest with the American people about the significance of the debt that we as Americans face. To me, this budget ambushes the American people. President, under the pretense of economizing, promises to cut $4 trillion of deficit over 10 years. But the budget itself actually piles $11 trillion of new debt in that same time frame. Under the pretense of helping everyone to prosper, To me, the President's budget buries every single American under a mountain of debt. And that is a debt that's going to rob more and more from their paychecks with each passing year. The savings that the President promises are not going to come. And the spending that he demands are things that we cannot afford. It just seems to me that this President's budget is another painful step on the road to bankrupting America. So here we are in the fourth year of the presidency, and for each of those 4 years, the deficit has exceeded $1 trillion. $1 trillion each of the 4 years of this presidency. So how does that match with what the President has been saying? Well, in February of 2009, the President had been president about a month, he made a pledge, and the pledge was that he would cut the deficit in half by the end of his first term in office. Now here we are, the final year, the President's first term in office, and this deficit is still above $1 trillion. Once again, what the President has said to the American people is very different than what he has delivered to the American people. And I'm still waiting for a chance in this body, in the Senate, to vote on the President's budget. The majority leader, who sits in the front row, has said he doesn't intend to even bring it to the floor of the United States Senate for a discussion or a debate or a vote. The law is pretty clear. The President has to introduce a budget by a certain date. The President missed that deadline, and the Senate and the House have to go ahead and pass a budget, which this body has not done now for over 1,000 days. Multiple years, no budget has passed this body. There actually was a vote last year on the President's budget. It was one that has been, the budget itself was called irresponsible, and a number of press renderings on it, and the majority leader refused to bring it to the Senate, so the minority leader brought the President's budget to the Senate. Not one Republican voted for it, but not one Democrat voted for the President's budget either, Mr. President. The total count on the President's budget last year in the United States Senate, 0 votes for the President's budget, 97 votes against the President's budget. And the President introduces another budget this year, ignoring the 2 major tidal waves that we face, the tidal waves of Social Security and Medicare. So it's interesting, you read it in the New York Times. Obama faces task of selling dueling budget ideas. President Obama, more than ever, confronts the challenge of persuading voters that he has a long-term plan to reduce the deficit, even as he highlights stimulus spending. Challenging to persuade voters that he has a long-term plan to reduce the deficit. What did he promise? What did he deliver? What we see is a health care law where he promised one thing, delivered something very different. We see it now in the budget. And the numbers are so large, the numbers are so astronomically large that it is hard for one to comprehend how much a deficit of $1 trillion truly is. You can visit with high school students, or you visit with service clubs or a town hall meeting, go to senior centers. The number is so large, it's hard to wrap one's mind around it. And the President tries to make people believe that everything was okay if he could just raise some taxes, just a little bit, he says, on some of the other people. Not you, but other people, and everything would be fine. When you actually look through this, to get to $1 trillion, to get to the $1.3 trillion, which is what the President has proposed in this year's budget as a deficit, you could take all the millionaires, billionaires, things he likes to rail about, take not just a little bit, you take every penny they earn. Every penny they earn over that $1 million. Every penny. All of them combined. And then on top of that, sell off all the gold in Fort Knox. All of it. take all of the money that people earn over $1 million and all the gold in Fort Knox, add it all together, and that is not even enough to cover just the deficit, that $1 trillion that the President plans to spend over and above what comes in. It is completely irresponsible, but that's what we've seen from this administration. So we have a president that makes presentations, gives speeches, and yet what the American people see is something very different. So this morning in the Energy Committee, we had an opportunity to visit with the Secretary of Energy specifically on budgetary issues relating to the budget in the future. And, of course, the President said he supported an all-of-the-above energy plan for the country. Well, I support an all-of-the-above energy plan for the country. But when you go through the details, that's not exactly what the American people see. What the American people see is the cost of gasoline at the pump continuing to go up. And they see an administration that is blocking an opportunity to move energy, oil, from northern parts of our country as well as from Canada to the United States for use here. So, take a look at the headlines of front page USA Today a couple of days ago. Chaotic spring predicted for gas. Average prices likely to hit $4.05 a gallon. People care about that. People all across the country, they drive around, they see the signs up, and they see what the cost of a gallon of gasoline is, and they know it, and they see it impacting in their daily lives. A number of us visited today at the Energy Committee and talked about today's Wall Street Journal article. This morning, oil rise imperils budding recovery. We want this country to recover. We want to get people back to work. We want people to make it easier and cheaper for the private sector to hire working people. Get America working again. Price of energy goes up. Price of oil goes up. Oil rise imperils budding recovery. What does it say? The average price of gasoline, of a gallon of regular gasoline, has jumped 13.1 cents to $3.51 in the past month. So gasoline at the pump up 13 cents in the last month, according to AAA. It goes on and says some parts of the country have seen even bigger increases, with prices approaching $4 a gallon in parts of California. Higher prices at the pump. And this is where it really hits home. This is what I hear about at home in Wyoming when the price of gasoline goes up and we drive great distances, Mr. President, in your home state and my home state. People notice it because it impacts on other things that they can use that same money for. And as it says here in the Wall Street Journal, higher prices at the pump force consumers to cut back spending on discretionary items like restaurant meals, haircuts, family vacations, hurting those industries. I mean, isn't that what it's really about? As the price of gasoline at the pump goes up, it hurts the ability of families and the quality of life that they could spend that money in other ways. As it says, a prolonged increase can drive up inflation and drive down hiring. We're a country that wants people to get back to work. We want to give those opportunities, and it just seems that the President's budget and the policies of this administration and a rejection of things that would actually help us with American energy are going to make it harder for families. When prices of gasoline go up, the impact on an average family can be over $1,000 a year of an impact in terms of their ability to have disposable income. And if you're a family dealing with a mortgage and bills and kids, that is a huge difference in the quality of life for those American families. You know, states around the country get it. I look at Wyoming. We're in our legislative session there right now. We balance our budget every year. Constitution demands it. If less money comes in, we spend less money. They make the tough decisions. The President said he wants to make this, he's ready to make the tough decisions, but I don't see tough decisions in this budget. What I see is a political document, a campaign document, something that has more stimulus money in it, money so we can promise people things. And we all know how that first so-called stimulus program went. To me, it was a failure. We have spending on about $800 billion. The President promised if they passed the stimulus program, unemployment rate would stay less than 8%. And they put out charts. And by today, from those charts, the unemployment rate should be 6%. Unemployment rate's still 8.3%. It's been over 8% for 36 months now. So when you look at this and look at the President's budget, I mean, to me, it's debt on arrival. The budget spends $47 trillion. It borrows $11 trillion. It increases the national debt to $26 trillion by 2022. It is debt upon debt upon debt. So where do you borrow the money from? Well, a lot of it you borrow from overseas, a lot of it from China. So what role is China playing now? Well, they're continuing to lend us money. And, oh, by the way, when the President blocked the Keystone XL pipeline, what did China say to our friends, our northern neighbors, our big trading partners to Canada? The United States doesn't want it. If President Obama isn't interested, we'll take the oil in China. The Prime Minister of Canada was in China last week doing exactly that, cutting a deal with the Chinese for energy that will be sold from Canada. I think we should want it. I think if we want to be energy secure and work on energy security, which to me is an issue of national security, we should want that energy. Good jobs, the amount of money in terms of jobs that's available. This isn't government money, private money to put those people back to work. We haven't seen it, and this administration, through its budget and through its policies, continue to oppose those efforts for American jobs. So what we see is spending goes up under the President's 10-year budget proposal. The spending goes up every year without stop. Every year from now over the next 10 years, spending goes up. And we see trillion-dollar deficits year after year after year. And one of the most disturbing things to some of my colleagues who have accounting degrees, especially my senior senator from the state of Wyoming, who is an accountant, who's run businesses, he looks at this and he can point out easily the budgetary gimmicks, the accounting tricks that have been used over and over again to make this budget, as irresponsible as it happens to be, to try to make it look not as bad as it really is. This budget is bad for America, and it is a continuation of a number of policies that have come out of this administration that have made it harder and more expensive for the private sector to create jobs in this country. And what I'm trying to do is look for ways to make it easier and cheaper for the private sector to create jobs in this country. We have not seen it in the President's budget. We have not seen it in the policies of this administration. We have not seen it in this President. So, thank you very much, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Vermont is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask consent to speak for up to 10 minutes as in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, in a way, I'm almost reluctant to say this because it also just points to one of the reasons why so many people wonder if Congress has just become totally dysfunctional. But I looked at how the Senate was forced to spend the better part of this week ending a filibuster against the nomination of Judge Alberto Jordan of Florida to fill a judicial emergency vacancy on the 11th Circuit. Finally, we had a 4-month filibuster, Republican filibuster, on this judge. I would note that within hours of him being reported unanimously out of the Senate Judiciary Committee 4 months ago, Democrats, clearly every single Democrat said they're prepared to go for a vote on right immediately. For 4 months he was held up by a Republican filibuster. We broke it on Monday by an 89-5 cloture vote. And even then, Republicans insisted on another 2 additional delays on this good man. finally the Senate is allowed to vote on. Incidentally, when we are allowed to vote on, we confirmed them 94-5. You know, if we'd voted on 4 months and 2 days earlier, when we wanted to, the vote would have been the same. It was a colossal waste of the Senate's time, a colossal waste of America's time, and another week lost to obstruction delay. Now the Senate Majority Leader has been required to file another cloture petition on yet another consensus nominee. This is the 9th time the Majority Leaders had to file a cloture petition to overcome a Republican filibuster of one of President Obama's superbly qualified judicial nominees. The nomination of Jesse Furman to fill a vacancy in the Southern District of New York has been stalled for more than 5 months after being reported unanimously from the Senate Judiciary Committee. So first 4 months on the first Cuban-American to go on the 11th Circuit. He was stalled by Republicans for 4 months. Now we have somebody being stalled for 5 months. In the past, when somebody's been reported unanimously, every single Republican, every single Democrat voting for them on the Judiciary Committee, we consider them consensus nominations, and they usually been taken up and confirmed by the Senate within days or weeks. And we've done this whether we've had a Democratic or Republican president. Certainly this was the approach taken by Senate Democrats when President Bush sent us consensus nominees, where we were able to move the 17 months the Democrats were in charge during the president's first term in office. We moved successfully 100 of his judges, even though they were not the people that would have been probably nominated by a Democratic president. We thought he'd work for consensus. We moved them. But in an almost complete reversal of what we did for President Bush, Mr. Furman's nomination by President Obama has been blocked by Senate Republicans for 5 months without reason or explanation. Is it question anybody's mind why the American people look at what this kind of Republican obstruction and wonder what in heaven's name is the Congress doing? And regrettably, for the second time, we'll have to vote to end a Republican filibuster of one of President Obama's district court nominations. I cannot recall a single instance in which a president's judicial nomination to a federal trial court, a federal district court, was blocked by a filibuster. And yet, Senate Republicans nearly did so last year when they sought to filibuster Judge Jack McConnell's nomination in the Rhode Island District Court, despite the strong support of both home state senators who know their state best. At that time, I emphasized the danger of rejecting the Senate's traditional deference to home state senators and began to filibuster district court nominations. Now, fortunately, the Senate rejected that filibuster, and Judge McConnell was confirmed overwhelmingly. But like the needless delay in Judge Jordan's confirmation, the first Cuban-American to the circuit, the Republican filibuster Jesse Furman, by any traditional measure, is a consensus nominee, is just another example of the tactics that have all but paralyzed the Senate confirmation process, but are also damaging, seriously damaging our federal courts by this kind of obstruction by the Republicans. It should not take 5 months and require a cloture motion for the Senate to proceed to vote in this nomination. You have to remember, Mr. President, nearly 1 out of every 10 judgeships is vacant. We have over 20 judicial nominations that are reported favorably by the committee. 16 of them have been stalled in the Senate calendar since last year. Nearly all of them superbly qualified consensus nominees. We have to ask, what are they thinking in doing this? Why are they willing to hurt our federal courts American people by these partisan tactics. You know, I read with interest this morning Gail Collins' column in the New York Times. She spoke of the approval rating of Congress. She notes that Congress is unpopular, like the Ebola virus or zombies, or like TV shows about hoarders with dead cats in their kitchens. Well, that about sums it up. Ms. Collins goes on to discuss Republican filibusters of judicial nominees and writes, this week the Senate confirmed Judge Alberto Jose Jordan to a seat in the Federal Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit in Atlanta. A visitor from another country might not have appreciated the proportions of this achievement, given that Jordan was born in Cuba and who once clerked for Sandra Day O'Connor, had no discernible opposition, close quote. But it was blocked since way last year. Incidentally, I ask consent that a copy of Ms. Collins' column be placed in the record at the conclusion of my remarks.